Thanks for tuning in, everyone. I'm Ben Logan with Michigan Engineering, and I'm here with two intelligent and far more qualified individuals to talk about the world's best-known cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, that is. And today I've been told that Bitcoin is at $10,977. So with me, we have computer science and engineering PhD candidate David Adrian, and Dr. Lynette Shaw, an assistant professor of complex systems in the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts. So I want to thank you both for being here today. And before we dive in, if you wouldn't mind just briefly describing how your research or expertise might lend itself to the conversation today. And I guess, Lynette, if you wouldn't mind going first.
Sure, yeah. So I did my dissertation looking at social constructions of value and money surrounding new digital currencies. So what that essentially means is how, over the course of the past 9 years, Bitcoin has come to acquire worth and the social processes that have been involved in that happening.
It's been around for 9 years.
9 years, since the first one, yeah.
And David?
So I am now in my 4th year of the PhD program at Michigan and 8th year in Ann Arbor, because I did undergrad here as well. Most of sort of the research that I've been doing has just been studying how people use cryptography on the internet. And obviously cryptography is a part of cryptocurrencies. Sort of the original meaning of crypto, which any cryptographer is happy to complain about how people have stolen that term. But broadly speaking, we've been looking at how people use cryptography, use different types of cryptography, and it's the same stuff underlying the cryptocurrencies.
Awesome. And I guess, I might want to just get this out in the open before we go any further. Full disclosure, I do not have any Bitcoins. I am not an investor. Are either of you invested in Bitcoin?
I have a little bit of Bitcoin. I brought some when I was in graduate school, bought some Ether. It's going well, so. Yeah.
And I have a little bit of XRP purely just for, we'll see what happens there, but.
All right, so let's just dive right in then. And we'll start with David. So how might you describe Bitcoin to someone like me who doesn't know much about it, knows it's a thing, sees it in the news, knows that one day it seems to be skyrocketing and the next day it's plummeting. So how might you just describe Bitcoin to the average person?
Usually I just tell people not to worry about the cryptography and just think of it as a super volatile asset, which people have done well with that. If you want to talk about sort of what the actual technology is, it's basically a verified distributed log that says that I paid Lynette some money and then she paid you some money. And it's all verified and sort of stored in this log format so that you know that nobody spent the same money more than once.
Lynette, would you want to add anything to that?
I think maybe just emphasize the decentralized nature of the log, so how this log is being maintained on all the nodes participating in the network simultaneously. So there's not one main person in charge of it. It's the network which is maintaining it. So that's pretty big deal.
All right. So Lynette, what have you seen as some of the biggest emotional, behavioral, or social ramifications as it relates to the rise of cryptocurrency?
Sure, yeah. So I mentioned the term social construction earlier. So in sociology, we think a lot about this notion, and so there's something called the Thomas theorem, which is if men define situations as real, they're real in their consequences. And basically what that's referring to is that in social life, we collectively have background ideas on how things are, and we forget that those are essentially made up, because everybody's in practice reifying them, reaffirming them, so they become deeply taken for granted. And it's not until a disruption comes along that we start thinking, wait, what's going on? So we think about this historically a lot in terms of race or gender. So what does it mean to be black seems very essentialized in the American context, or what it means to be a woman. But then social movements come along and they say, hey, wait a minute, all these assumptions you've made, we need to analyze them. So race and gender aren't the only social constructs out there. We can think about governments in a lot of ways, for instance, are a big elaborate fiction we all go along with. When it comes to modern life, one of the most important social constructs we have is that of money. It really does determine life or death. And absent of disruption like Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies, it's not really something we think about in our daily lives. We just know it's a real thing that matters. Bitcoin comes along, cryptocurrencies come along, you're like, wait, why does that have worth? Where does that value come from? And from, it starts with that question, but then we have to start looking at, wait, why does this other money have worth? And then we start getting all of these background ideas about the nature of money, value. Is there intrinsic worth? Is a state required for there to be economic value, et cetera, all out in the open? So that's very exciting to see a contemporary conversation on that happening right now. So.
And are there any basic kind of trends that you might want to?
So, well, you can see, so it's interesting, so Bitcoin's origins are actually deeply rooted in something called techno-libertarianism and the cypherpunk movement, which very much had their roots in a kind of metalism. So they were very interested in creating a digital analog to gold, essentially. They wanted to emphasize scarcity, et cetera. However, one of the features of gold is that it's assumed to have an intrinsic value to it, whereas a Bitcoin did not necessarily start with an intrinsic value. So that's a problem explanation-wise. So from here, you get into a more conventionalist notion of value, which is essentially things have value because humans have kind of just agreed that it does have worth. And so you have different poles that right now are in tension and trying to explain what's going on. So I'm not going to tell you which one's right, but we'll say that is happening.
All right.
Yeah.
David, so what is Bitcoin mining? And what is a mining pool?
So this gets sort of back to this idea of the distributed log that really is Bitcoin. People talk about applying blockchain technology to things and its applications, but really what a blockchain is just a decentralized log for mutually distrustful participants. Meaning that there's some group of people, none of which trusts the other, and you're trying to keep track of something. So that's why it's a log. In this case, we're keeping track of who has which money and who's sent money to other people. And so the way that Bitcoin sort of does this is they took two concepts that had kind of been around for a while and combined them. The first one is the concept of a hash chain or a Merkle tree, which is what is sort of the basis for the so-called blockchain. And the second one was a concept that someone came up with in the 90s for actually fighting email spam called proof of work, and sort of integrated it to get Bitcoin. And so the way that this works is roughly, we have these things called blocks. Inside of the blocks, we have a list of transactions. Then we have all these participants in the Bitcoin network are taking these blocks, running them through what's called a hash function, and adding a little bit of random data that they themselves are coming up with. And the first person to run them through this hash function, which is basically something that takes a lot of data and gives you a little bit of data, the first person to get one with an output format that has enough leading zeros, basically a special type of output that's very unlikely to get. This is basically a random function. You don't know what output you're going to get when you put in the input, so all you can do is guess. Everybody is trying to do that. This is what mining is. And so when a miner comes up with an output that looks correct, they're like, this is going to be the new state of the log. We've added these transactions that I've hashed. This money is transferred around, and the previous block in the chain is whatever the previous block was. And then everybody moves on to the next one. And so that's why it's a chain, is we have the chain of these blocks that store the transactions. And then to get to the trust side, Bitcoin did something kind of clever, which was basically say that whoever finds the next block gets a reward. That reward right now is 12.5 Bitcoin, which I guess is over $100,000 now. But the idea is that everybody is competing to get this reward, and they only get this reward if they're part of the longest chain. So everybody is incentivized to always use the same ledger that everyone else is using. If I split off and I start changing the ledger and trying to say I didn't actually spend some money, no one else is going to follow with me. I'm not going to be able to get any valid blocks. I'm not going to get this reward. The other chain is going to keep going with all of the honest miners that are trying to basically put the log in the correct format to store the transactions. It's just going to keep going and going and going. And so that's the proof of work part, is just doing this hashing. anyone can verify that pretty quickly. And then the chain part is, well, the hashing is of these blocks, which we've put in a chain. So effectively, mining is just doing the work to build the log. And when you find the next element in the log, you're given a reward, the 12.5 Bitcoin.
And as a miner, I mean, is that a lot of coding? Like, what? How are you actually mining?
So mining is basically just doing a bunch of computation as quickly as you can. It turns out that the type of computation that you need to mine Bitcoin blocks is really well done by the same technology that underlies video games. Like video cards do this well, and you can get specialized hardware versions of what are called ASICs that do this well. But really all mining is just running a program that's taking in the current state of the blockchain and trying to find the next state of the blockchain. And so a mining pool is just a group of people who have gotten together and said, look, mining's really hard because we're just guessing. Yeah. What if we work together and then split the 12.5 Bitcoin amongst ourselves?
Cool. So Lynette, you kind of started touching on this, but cryptocurrencies are borderless and not backed by constraints like the gold standard. So what are Bitcoin's advantages to traditional currency, or what might its disadvantages be?
So some of the advantages, and some of them are technical and some of them are more philosophical, political. So on the technical front, there's the potential for Bitcoin to provide basically an electronic form of cash. So this has been, that was actually in the white paper what it set out to be. It was essentially, you can think about cash if I give you $1, that doesn't require a third party. So I can just give you cash, and there's a degree of there's anonymity in that transaction, which depending on who you are, that's a good or bad thing. There is no need for a third party, which kind of can reduce the amount of friction in the system, the amount of cost in the system, can essentially enable people to be very independent in their transactions. You also mentioned the borderless quality. So right now, moving lots of money across national borders is very expensive. Doing so with cryptocurrency in many ways is very appealing. It's a potentially a very fast, it was fast when we talk about the network congestion that is currently being experienced. But hypothetically, it could be very fast, very low fees to do something like that. I mean, there's a company called BitPesa, for instance, who's already using Bitcoin to do remittances. So if you go work in a foreign country, you could send back money way more cheaply than you could in, say, Western Union. So that is some of the advantages. Some of the disadvantages, I would say, is that as of right now, there's obviously a huge amount of volatility in its worth, right? So merchants may be very hesitant to accept Bitcoin unless they're able to immediately exchange it for fiat because they're not sure if they hold on to it. They might, 50 Cent, I don't know if you saw this story, but 50 Cent back in 2014 sold his albums with Bitcoin. And then forgot about it, and so his 700 Bitcoin, or it's turned into like $7 million now. So that's somebody who accepted as payment, and it worked out well. But it could go the other way. Another big disadvantage is the energy cost. Right now, it's a huge amount of energy. So I think that the current estimate when the Bitcoin fever just hit was consuming amount of energy on par with New Zealand to mine all of this Bitcoin. So that, in the long term, is something that will need to be addressed as well. And then just generally growing the capacity of the network. It needs to be able to scale right now to be able to handle lots of payments, and it's not there yet. So,
the theoretical, I think, max number of transactions per second for Bitcoin is somewhere between 7 and 8 without some enhancements they've sort of put in. And if you compare that to Visa, they do about 24,000 transactions per second. And you have Bitcoin over here, which is currently doing 4.
Right.
So Bitcoin is unfortunately really bad for payments, which is kind of the exact opposite of what they set out to do. And so there are other sort of variants of the coins that do slightly better, but at the end of the day, if you're trying to send someone money, Bitcoin's not that good at it anymore. And in fact, I think just a day or two ago, Stripe, the payment provider that lots of companies use to handle credit cards, they accepted Bitcoin as well. You could set it up so that instead of taking credit cards, Stripe would take Bitcoin, they give you cash, you didn't have to see the Bitcoin. Stripe was like, you know what, we're done. Like, the transaction times are too slow, the transaction fees are too high, the value of the Bitcoin changes too quickly that we're not accepting the right amount of money for what people are trying to buy. We're not going to take Bitcoin as a payment anymore because it's bad for payments.
Right, and there is something kind of poetic in this. It's exactly because Bitcoin just became so valuable that it's experiencing these problems right now. It got so bad that other corporations like Microsoft and Steam stopped accepting Bitcoin. And the most poetic one was the North American Bitcoin Conference had to stop accepting Bitcoin for payment of tickets because the network got so congested and the fees for the transactions got so high.
So what are some of the security concerns with Bitcoin and other forms of cryptocurrency?
I mean, a lot of the concerns get back to just general computer security concerns. There's basically sort of two ways of holding on to Bitcoin. You can actually hold on to it using some key that you have and is in the blockchain, or you can pay someone else to hold on to it for you, like Coinbase. If you're buying Bitcoin through Coinbase or one of these exchanges, you don't actually own the Bitcoin. Coinbase does, and they're sort of giving you some of it, and then sort of bulking everybody's transactions up into a small number of larger ones, just the same way that a regular sort of stock exchange might. Right? If you're buying stocks on an exchange, you're not directly giving the money to, say, Microsoft or whatever it is you're buying. It's going through the exchange, and then money moves around. So the security concerns, if you have your own Bitcoin, like your key is actually in the blockchain, are the same as the concerns you'd have otherwise. Like, you need to protect the computer that has that key, and you need to not lose it, and you shouldn't you shouldn't get phished, you shouldn't forget where that key is, you shouldn't get your box like owned by some random Russian hacker or whatever, like, because people can steal your Bitcoins if they break into your computer. And then on the other side, if you're sort of paying someone else to hold on to your Bitcoin, like Coinbase, right, your Coinbase account is now super valuable. So you don't want to get phished on your Coinbase account. You want to make sure you've done things like set up two-factor authentication, which hopefully you're doing on your accounts anyway. But a lot of the sort of end-user security stuff comes back to the same stuff we've had to deal with for decades and don't have good answers for, which even boil down to things as simple as how do we prevent users from typing in their password to the wrong thing, from getting phished. Like, at some point, we need to stop blaming users for that and just acknowledge that computer security community has done a bad job at defending this.
Any thoughts on that?
I would just say there's been a particular sort of irony or tension in terms of the emergence and dominance of places like Coinbase, because again, one of the driving reasons for creating Bitcoin was to remove the need for third-party intermediaries. So to reintroduce them back into the system, for some people, goes against the basic philosophy of the whole project.
So why would a country want to ban a virtual currency?
There are reasons. So to start with, that anonymity I mentioned in the transactions, which makes it kind of desirable as a currency, is not necessarily something that governments necessarily like. So when it comes to enabling, for instance, purchases on the dark market, black markets, or online extortion, et cetera, the anonymity of Bitcoin is actually not perfect, but it is a far cry great, like, it's a far deal greater than when you're going through, for instance, banks, which have certain laws such as know your customer. There, the financial intermediaries have a responsibility to according to the law, to know the identity of their customers. So if the government wants to intervene on suspected money laundering or something else, it can come in and do so. So that's one reason that governments might be uncomfortable with cryptocurrency. Another one involves it is a very risky space for consumers right now. There's a lot of, beyond just the volatility, there's a lot of quote unquote scam coins, for instance, that happen. It's a decentralized network. There's no one in charge of it. You can't just say, hey, stop ripping people off. And the code is open source, so there's been iterations upon that. Ponzi schemes, fraud, it's a very difficult space for the government to protect right there. So those are the more noble aspects. Other reasons the governments might not like it, cryptocurrency and Bitcoin has been used, some people have referred to it as a disaster hedge. So if a government's currency, say in Venezuela, starts being devalued or is going through its own volatility, there is this drive to essentially take your Venezuelan money and turn it into Bitcoin to keep it away from that volatility. Obviously, that's not good for the currency of Venezuela, right? So not to pick on Venezuela, this has happened other places too, and could happen in any nation that undergoes like a sudden political rupture. So there's that. And then you get into finally like the original founding philosophies, like behind Bitcoin was the notion of creating a money that was outside of the control of the central banks and central state actors. So if you ascribe to that belief, then also nations would not like it because they lose their power if money doesn't require a central bank.
Well, I also have a question that I'm wondering if either of you know the answer to, which is, who is the real Satoshi Nakamoto?
I'm going to say it really doesn't matter anymore.
I was going to go with the friends we made along the way. But
we're all Satoshi.
I don't know. At this point, it doesn't matter that much anymore. It'd be interesting to see what happened if all of the coins that he owns suddenly got cashed out or transferred.
Yes,
that would probably cause a market panic, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Some of my money, and I was talking with a faculty member who was sort of a old cypherpunk type, and he was like, I bet it was Hell Finney. But Hell's dead now, so.
So that's a very convenient answer.
So any last recommendations or advice for those who might be thinking, I should invest in Bitcoin?
Never invest more than you can afford to lose. Just that is true for everything, and it is many times over more true for cryptocurrency.
I strongly agree with that, and I would sort of want to emphasize that at this point, the investing in it and the sort of working on the technology are pretty much completely separate because we've gone through and reintroduced all the things that we said we were trying to get rid of, like centralized banks and so on. And so at this point, it doesn't really, if you're investing in Bitcoin, the technology in it doesn't matter so much. It's just, don't invest more than you want to lose and hope you get lucky. But the market's so volatile that it turns out that a lot of people have done well just by holding on to it and hoping.
Keep holding.
And so finally, what's the future for cryptocurrency?
So one of the things I've been interested with cryptocurrency is how it's not one thing anymore. So over the course of its development, it's had many facets to it that have essentially been broken off and taken, right? So the notion of a blockchain technology is no longer fundamentally coupled to it being a stateless currency, for instance. So I would say that this arena of cryptocurrency is just now developing, and it's not going to be one thing. There are many, many things, and we'll see which of those different versions bear out in the long run.
Yeah, you've seen people sort of taking some of the concepts from Bitcoin and making either more centralized versions or applying it to other technologies. There's companies out there that build blockchain-like financial instruments for banks. I think Chain.com is one of them, where there's not a proof of work and there's a few sort of trusted parties instead of a completely decentralized currency. There's also, I think the one that's probably the most cool is called Zcash, which uses literally new math, math that was invented in 2013 to take the privacy, to improve on the privacy properties of Bitcoin. Bitcoin right now basically just uses pseudonyms. If you figure out someone's pseudonym, you know everything everyone they sent money to. Whereas if I gave you money, no one outside of us, if I just gave you a dollar bill, needs to know. And so they've actually managed to replicate that in the coin, those same properties that Cash has, with slightly better transaction times than Bitcoin. I think we're talking 8 to 20 a second. But I think that's sort of the future is going to be not Bitcoin itself, but other things that have taken on Bitcoin and improved it. Whether that means crazy altcoins or what was it, the pot coin that Dennis Rodman was pushing out. I don't know about that, but I think we will see sort of improvements in using blockchain for things besides Bitcoin itself. And Bitcoin will probably end up just being an asset.
Right on. Well, I think that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank you both very much for talking with me about Bitcoin. I've learned a lot.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, and thank you for watching, and please share this video with your favorite Bitcoin buddy, and have a great weekend.
And go blue.
Go blue.